Harold, you mentioned earlier that the efforts that some countries have had to either ban or restrict spanking actually is a ban or a restriction on authoritative or traditional parenting. Can you tell us how we know that
Yes.
that's the case?
There's one clear way to know that, and one has to look at what is the prevalence of the parental use of spanking in the different parenting styles. And by far the highest usage of spanking is in the high demandingness parenting styles, which are authoritative, directive, and authoritarian. And the lowest usage is in disengaged, permissive, and positive parenting styles. So what they're really doing is they're trying to force everyone from whatever parenting style they predominantly use into positive parenting. That's the intent.
Would you say then that the use of physical discipline is integral or almost required for, say, authoritative parenting, which has, as you say, the best outcomes for children?
Again, it's nuanced, so one can't say that it's 100%, and it isn't. There are traditional authoritative parents, or parents who predominantly raise their children under those styles, who have not and do not use spanking, but it's not because they've made a conscious decision not to, then they would not be considered in that parenting style category. Rather, it's by default. Their particular child's demeanor and behavior is such that it is successfully managed using milder methods in the spectrum before one gets to there.
So if they had a different type of child, you might expect different results.
Yes, that's exactly right. And there's another reason why parents who have many different children will very quickly realize that these are all unique individuals with their own personalities. And because of that, some responses that have worked exceptionally well particularly for a particular child will seem to be useless for another one. And so this is why it's also important for parents to have the widest spectrum of tools available in their toolkit from which they can draw upon, because certain responses will just be better for a particular child and not for another one.
You've done some research on corporal punishment and fertility rates. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. There had been the notion raised that it's not just these prescriptions against spanking, but the general trend in the world in the last generation or so has been very much to usurp parental authority and take away a lot of things that we would consider are the responsibility and the purview of parents in raising their children, and abdicate those to the state or the government. And one of the questions that's raised that is with all of these different things going on and with all these pressures on parents, the risk of raising children seems to be rising, whereas the benefits of having them seems to be diminishing. And one of the questions we are interested in the answer to is there a material effect in criminalizing parents from using minor force and disciplining which actually deters family formation? And fairly convincingly, we see the answer is yes. So it's very interesting because we published this work in 2015, Parental Spanking Bans and Societal Disinterest in Children, How They Relate by Fertility Rate Analysis. Now I'm going to have to say that this is a circuitous type of research because it's chicken and egg. We don't know if it's the people who don't have children and therefore have no experience in raising them on a day-to-day basis. Are they the ones that come up with these ideological oppositions to using methods such as spanking? Or is it the fact that spanking is criminalized and then this is a deterrent on people having children? So the best laboratory for this, again, is in the EU and Scandinavia. and so on. And what we found is, again, correlation is not causation, but we found a very direct correlation between countries that have banned spanking or banned traditional authoritative parenting systems and methods in general, tend to have much lower fertility rates or more rapidly collapsing fertility rates than countries that do not have these policies. And I would say that the very best example of this is right in the middle of the EU, where you have France, where 87% of parents spank. Their fertility rate is a half a point higher than the 3 surrounding countries where it's illegal, which is Spain, Italy, and Germany. And one of the problems with this, we did some research in 2012 when we actually talked to Germans on this issue. So this is anecdotal, but we did get some very enlightening comments in regards to these bans on spanking, and do you see any effect? And we have had commentaries which I would paraphrase would say, the risk of having children now outweighs the benefits, so they are best avoided. And that's a very toxic idea to instill in a society, because if the society in general suddenly believes that having children is a bad idea, that society will extinct itself. And Germany is a prime example. If you look at fertility rates, you need a fertility rate of about 2.1, that's called replacement. 2.1 children for 2 parents. When you subtract deaths from illness and accidents and so on, you're left with 2 children, and that is replacement for the 2 parents that would pass away. In these countries, by the way, there's been research that showed throughout history of mankind, once a fertility rate has dropped below 1.5, that is called the point of no return. When you reach that point, it's mathematically impossible to turn that around. So that society will eventually collapse. Germany, at the time of that study, so we're working on 2012 data, had a fertility rate of 1.3. But if you back out the 30% of immigrants, which tend to have more children or bring children with them into that country, and you look at the indigenous German women, their fertility rate is actually 0.9 at that point. So that society is irreparably collapsing. And what it will look like in 100 years, no one knows. But the German society, as anyone has known, is going extinct and will disappear.
Do you think that part of the reason these fertility rates are declining, and I know you said this is correlational, but do you think that part of the reason that the fertility rates are declining is because of the spanking bans? You mentioned risks and benefits of having children. What do those words mean? Risks and benefits, what are those?
Parents are genuinely afraid of the overreach of the child protective apparatus and the state, and it's becoming, in all westernized countries, this is becoming more and more of a real issue, and it is a real deterrent on childbirth in general, because people don't know how to respond to their child's behavior, and they are afraid of all these interventions where their children are apprehended, or they're put in jail for responsibly raising their children. It's just a myriad of things, and when people see this from the outside looking in, they start to formulate an unconscious opinion that, gee, having children is really, it's just a lot of problems, and there's a lot of risks to this, and there's no benefits to it. The state doesn't reward us to do this. They only punish us if we're not doing exactly what they tell us to do. And so and we found that has a material effect. It has collapsed the fertility rates in those countries comparatively by up to 0.5 child per female. We also looked at the same phenomenon in New Zealand versus Australia, Oceania, and found that as of the 2007 spanking ban in law in New Zealand, that is having a great deterrent effect, and the rate of change in fertility heading lower is substantially, there's a higher rate of change, which means that that one particular law is actually having a negative, measurable negative effect on family formation.
Do these bans, though, or these restrictions, do they at least create more peaceful children or more resilient children or anything like that?
Now, all of the evidence from 5 decades of parenting system science, which deduces what the predominant parenting style is in the household and then tracks the developmental outcome of the child, shows us pretty consistently that traditional authoritative parenting still is optimally the best developmental system. So by default, when you remove that by law or by whatever mechanism, you are then necessarily forcing parents into inferior parenting systems.
And is that having a result, is that showing a result in the statistics we see in criminality or other
Yes.
factors?
There's one publication we put together, which is a free publication called Sweden, the Canary in the Coal Mine, How the Abolition of Traditional Parenting Destroys a Society. I know that's a strong word, but that's exactly what's going on. There's been a lot of research done, not by myself, but by many, many in the field. Dr. Robert Larzalier of Oklahoma State, Dr. Marjorie Gunno of Calvin College, Michigan, and so on. Many. And this is a summation of all those works. And so the myth or the claim is that if we remove spanking, we are going to raise more peaceful, more productive, and more developed children. In fact, in every single country where any of these attributes are studied, consistently the opposite is shown. And Sweden in 1979, that's when they imposed their spanking ban. That was a very peaceful functioning society in the 1970s, and it has arguably descended into the most violent and dysfunctional westernized country today. And a lot of it is due to that, because what happened was the children who were raised immediately after that ban, and Dr. Larzalier has done a lot of work on this, showed that their youth violence rate was 519% of the violence rate of the children raised before that ban, which would have been primarily raised with traditional methods. The violence rate there, the youth violence rate has only increased. It has had the effect of causing many negative outcomes. I'd like to point a few out because they're counterintuitive, but they're very important to know. If we're talking about violence rates, I believe the youth violence rate is now about 22 times per capita what it was then. So obviously and very clearly the opposite effect has happened. We've already talked about alcoholism and substance abuse, and we know that Sweden has amongst the highest drug-induced death rates. That comes from somewhere, and that comes from a lack of the emotional and psychological resilience that parents would instill in their children at an early age. And that all goes down to parenting style. There are claims made about domestic violence. Well, those claims are utterly debunked. There was the Bussmann study of European country comparatives. That was, I believe the study was done in 2009 and published in 2011. It looked at domestic violence rates in different countries on 2 measures. One was insulted marital-like partners, so you know, the husband and wife are insulting each other, and the other is physical violence, tackled or hit your partner. So Sweden, which is the first banned country, the insulted marital-like partners was 79% rate. The rate of insulting marital partners in other spanking ban countries, 64%. The rate in insulting marital partners in non-ban countries, 36%. So the rate in the spanking ban countries is double. That comes from child development. Those children have not been developed properly, and it's resulting in their inability to control themselves, and this leads to spontaneous violent outbursts, and that can clearly be seen in these marital situations. If we go to husbands or wives or partners that have actually physically assaulted each other, so domestic violence in the home, the Swedish rate is 34%. The rate of other spanking ban countries is 32%. The rate in no ban countries is 18%. So again, the rate in the countries where traditional authoritative parenting has been banned, the domestic violence rates are double than those in countries where that's allowed and still a predominant parenting system.
I want to talk a bit about myths that we hear about spanking. Is it true that spanking causes harm?
Okay, that's a nuanced question because the type of material that presents as research to prove that particular claim does a few things actually that are scientifically deceptive. The very first one is they tend to combine harsh and abusive treatments. And as we've said before, this is nuanced. So one has to look at what's the definition. As a matter of fact, there's a very famous study that proves that point, and it was a survey study with questions, and the questionnaire did not have one question asking about any experience with childhood spanking, yet in the conclusions, several times it denigrates childhood spanking. It's akin to doing a study on the harms of methamphetamine addictions and in the conclusion saying we should ban aspirin. It's the same type of trickery going on. The other thing is, because it's a social science, it's very complex. The family dynamic is complex. So the only way that one could actually uniquely determine that spanking will cause a harm that no other approach would cause is you would have to remove all of the other variables. Has there been any screaming in the house? Okay, we can't use that data. Has anybody done this? Has anybody done that? Has there been financial hardship or unemployment? Was it a single mother? Because we know that the child development from children raised by single moms is on a broad spectrum about 8 times worse than those raised by a nuclear family, and so on. And they intentionally never adjust for all of these other factors, which in effect are probably the main causes of the results that they see. And the third part, which I may have mentioned earlier, is this. Spanking is a consequence, and any consequence is simply a response to a pre-existing condition. We have a behavior that is an antisocial behavior, and we are going to apply different consequences to see if we can adjust it. And what this research does, which is very deceptive, it says, oh, someone was spanked and they have this antisocial behavior, therefore the spanking, which is a response to a pre-existing condition, is the cause of the condition. And that's completely false. It's the same, like I say, with chemotherapy. People who have cancer, many of them receive chemotherapy as a treatment, as an attempt to solve their cancer. And the way that this research works, it says the cancer was caused by the chemotherapy, so we should ban chemotherapy. When in actual fact, the cancer was a pre-existing condition, and the chemotherapy is one known technique which should be availed of because it has been proven in many cases to cure the cancer, but not in all. There is no method that is the one-size-fits-all for everything.
Isn't there, though, a spectrum that some parents can risk going down if they start to use spanking? Doesn't that perhaps encourage them to use physically abusive tactics?
No, that's another argument that has been made in the past. There's an escalation. I wholeheartedly disagree with that. And I disagree with that because, first of all, as the technique as it is, and as described before, how it's used in authoritative parenting, it is used in a spectrum of other approaches being used first. It's not a first go-to. So it should be used occasionally and also moderately. Typically for a preteen child, the degree of force does not have to be that high. It's the act of doing it which actually sends a psychological message of disapproval. And I think and this is also why we have laws which objectively give you tests. There is no way to apply ever increasing force, as that claim would state, because the law has a limit on the force, and those limits are very low.
Doesn't the act of using physical discipline give the parent a taste for something that might not be appropriate later on?
I don't understand the question.
If you start using some spanking, doesn't that give you a taste for, say, treating your children violently?
No.
Why not?
No. In the same token that, so this is the old myth that if you use spanking in disciplining, it teaches the child to hit other people, which we now have resoundingly debunked. We know it's actually the opposite. That's not true. But let's take a look at a different style. Then, if their claim, which we now know is not true, it doesn't acclimatize children so that when they grow up, they use violence and hitting as a means of expression, is the same way as if one uses confinements, such as timeout and being sent to the bedroom. It does not mean that when the child becomes an adult, their way to resolve conflict with other adults is to force them to sit in chairs or lock them in rooms.
Good, thank you. I want to ask some sort of off the beaten track questions here. What is some of the best research that you have seen on spanking? Whether it's your own or someone else's?
There's a lot of it out there. I would say that outside of what we've done at Iron Gate Research, the number one, I would say, is the research that has been put out through Oklahoma State by Dr. Robert Larselier. That is really good in-depth research, particularly on the issue of Sweden, where he has found data and really broken out the rate of change in various things, including child abuse rates and child-on-child violence and so on, before and after, and a long time after traditional parenting was criminalized. I would, if I had to point to one piece of research, I think I'd point to that.
Is there one book or film about any topic, doesn't have to be corporal punishment, anything, that you would recommend to people in general? Could be about anything.
There's quite a few. So this is a really tough one. I would go back though, generally in this whole genre. Dr. Larselier, in conjunction with Dr. Gunno and several others, have written a book called Authoritative Parenting. I believe it's a synthesis of nurturance and discipline is the subtitle. I think that is the number one book. It's not an easy read because they are academics. It's written very much in an academic style with 1,000 citations. But I believe that anyone who would read that and can absorb the material, that most completely presents the entire nub of the entire parenting system issue and why it is what it is.
If you could pick one issue in your field that has to die, what would that be?
Resoundingly, this is the miseducation and misinformation that social workers have been exposed to the point where, can I talk about the Children's Aid Societies for a minute or two? In different countries, the child protection apparatus works differently. In Canada and in Ontario, where I am, this is not a function performed by the government. It's performed by private NGOs. We have 47 of them that are set up as charitable, not-for-profit corporations. They're called Children's Aid Societies. Here's one of the major issues, the funding model. The Ontario government gives them $1.5 billion a year collectively, and the rest they raise through donations and other means. The way that these Children's Aid Societies compete for a slice of the Ontario government's funding is as follows. It's by the number of caseloads they have, the number of child apprehensions, the number of placements into foster care, the number of detainees in state care, etc. And all of these things, when you add them up, turn into a number, and they are awarded their funding relative to other children's ages based on those numbers. And what it does is actually very sinister, because it incentivizes them to open files and create victims where none exist, and to take children from safe and loving homes where they are at no risk of harm, simply to support their quotas and caseload targets for their funding model. So it's actually become a business model. And that does not work in the best interest of the child. It actually works in the opposite. That's the number one thing that needs to be fixed. And all the people who are being hired tend to come with these liberal arts degrees or what have you, where they are not being educated on any parenting science at all. They are being miseducated on what I essentially call anti-spanking propaganda by 4 names. And because of that, they have a worldview and a parenting view that is completely false and harmful. And they are so zealotly believing in this view that there have been reports where these social workers would go into a home and tell parents that it is illegal for them to spank, even though it's fully legal, and we have laws, and threaten them that they would do jail time and they would apprehend their children if they ever spank their child again. And that's completely criminal behavior, and it's also very destructive for parental authority, very destructive for the development of that child. That is the number one issue I can see. And I don't think that's an Ontario issue or a Canada issue. I know it's an American issue with Title IV defunding, and I know that also I think it's becoming fairly apparent that ironically, the worst violators of human rights or children's rights in the Western world happen to be the countries that purported that they were upstanding for these rights, and they are Sweden and Norway through their Barnevernet child protection system.